Okay, class. In this brief podcast, I want to talk about the political system in the U.S. before 1860, and it's the fracturing of the political system, of political parties in particular, that helps push the U.S. towards civil war, and also symbolizes the splits in the nation. So here's the roundup for political parties before 1860. First of all, you have the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was created during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. It helped elect Jefferson. It existed uh, in the 1860s. It exists to this very day. It's never gone out of business. Now, I would say fragmented, but hold on here. My share screen is not working. I don't think the right word would be fragmented, but it was just there were what historians call island communities. There weren't a lot of things that tied Americans together, like railroads and that kind of a thing. And one of the things that tied together the sections, the North and South, was the Democratic Party. You had Northern Democrats and you had Southern Democrats. And this never really stopped. Now, one of the things about Northern Democrats is, for the most part, at least until the 1850s, Northern Democrats were willing to work with Southern Democrats in the perpetuation of slavery. Uh, so you had an alliance of Northerners who did not own slaves who worked with Southerners who did own slaves. So the Democratic Party was this alliance. It was a national alliance. You had Democrats in Maine, you had Democrats in Texas, South Carolina. And it was very significant party. Like I say, the strongest party in the United States. And what's going to happen in the 1850s is the Democrats start fragmenting. Northern Democrats, in particular, who are against expansion, start to bridle and bristle at the fact that other Democrats were willing to work with Southern slaveholders to expand slavery. So the Democratic Party is going to come under extreme pressure in the 1850s, but it never disappears. It exists throughout this period, during the Civil War, after the Civil War, and it exists to this very day. Now, rule of thumb, though, when we think about the Democratic Party in the 2020s, it's the Liberal Party in the U.S. During this period, the Democratic Party could not be really described as the Liberal Party. The heart of the Democratic Party was the slaveholding South, although you did have, of course, Northern Democrats that didn't own slave in alliance with Southern Democrats. So you didn't have it was just a very, very different setup. It was the more, if we can use left and right, it was the more conservative party of the time. Again, never goes out of business, but comes under extreme pressure during the 1850s, and I'm going to talk about that. Okay, on the other side, you have the Whig Party. And Whig, when I say the word Whig, that's one of the things that students really tune out. It sounds so boring. It's spelled W-H-I-G. It comes from England, from Great Britain. And the Whig Party was also a national party. You had Whigs in the North and Whigs in the South. But the Whig Party in the North was much stronger than the Whig Party in the South. The Whig Party in the South existed, but it was pretty weak. Now, an example of a Whig from the South was Mr. Sands, who was the father of Harriet Jacobs' two children. He was a Whig. He was a moderate in the Southern context. But basically, the Whig Party was stronger in the North. It had an anti-slavery element that Southerners, of course, despised. And it was much weaker than the Democratic Party. And it did contest in elections, but it just wasn't nearly the powerhouse that the Democratic Party was. So the Whig Party was a national party, but it wasn't nearly as strong as the Democratic Party because it was so weak in the South, even though, as I said before, you did have Whigs in the South. Okay, what happens in the 1850s? Because of events that I'm going to talk about, the Whig Party just goes out of business. It disappears. But Whigs didn't disappear. A spaceship didn't come down from Mars and take all the Whigs to Mars. What happens is the Whigs, out of the ashes of the Whig Party, grew the Republican Party. And a good example of that is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a very loyal Whig. He'd been a Whig Party member since he was a young man. He was elected to Congress as a part of the Whig Party. But when the Whig Party goes out of business in the 1850s, for reasons that I'm going to talk about later in this podcast, what happens is the Whigs coalesce into the Republican Party. And so this is how we get the Republican Party. Whigs, once their party goes out of business, they become Republicans. But other coalition, the Republican Party is a coalition party. Some other members of the Republican Party were Democrats who were very, very unhappy that their party was working with slaveholders and they couldn't take it anymore. So you had a portion of Northern Democrats leave the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is much stronger than the Whig Party ever was. But here's the key thing, and this is what you really need to keep in mind. The Republican Party only existed in the free states. It did not exist in the South. You could get killed if you were a member of the Republican Party in Texas by the late 1850s. It was downright dangerous. So the Republican Party is a very powerful party, but it's only a sectional party. It only exists in the free states. But the reason it's powerful is, I talked about earlier in this podcast, remember, there's 20 million whites in the free states, and there's 8 million whites in the South. Now, of course, African Americans count as 3/5 of a person when it comes to voting. But basically, by the 1850s and definitely by 1860, the northern states have gained a demographic edge on the southern states, just in terms of sheer population. That's why Abraham Lincoln could become elected president of the United States in 1860 and not get one electoral vote, because the northern states just start dominating the nation just in terms of sheer numbers. So again, to repeat, the Democratic Party, very strong national party, starts to fracture a bit during the 1850s. Southern Democrats stay true to the party, but Northern Democrats, there's a fight among Northern Democrats about the question of slave expansion, and some Northern Democrats ultimately leave the party. The competing party in 1850 was the Whig Party. It was very strong in the North. It was weak in the South. It had an abolitionist wing. But in the mid-1850s, the Whig Party goes out of business, and the Whigs move over to the Republican Party, which is a very powerful coalition party made up of ex-Whigs and also disaffected Democrats from the North who have left the party. But the Republican Party is only a sectional party. It only exists in the states of the North. It does not exist in the South. But the advantage that the Republican Party had when it came to national politics is the free states of the North, in terms of sheer numbers, the population of the northern states is more than double, even if you include the free fifth clause of slaves, that of the South. So the Republican Party, even though it only existed in the free states, is able to elect Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And that's only 4 or 5 years after the Republican Party was created. They're able to elect a president of the United States. So that's the lineup. Democrats always with us. Whigs, they're at the beginning of the 1850s, go out of business, and then you have the creation of this very powerful coalition party, the Republican Party, which is a sectional party which only exists in the North.